Harold Bennett's voice barely echoed through the luxury law office before Isabel Gonzales realized she had just buried her father twice. The entirety of Victor Gonzales's estate, the attorney said carefully, will transfer to his surviving spouse, Diane Whitaker Gonzales. Silence. Then Diane sighed dramatically and reached for a tissue she didn't need. Across the polished mahogany table, Isabel stared at the woman who hadn't spent a single night in the hospital while Isabel drained her savings paying chemotherapy bills, ICU fees, private nurses and surgeries to keep her father alive. And beside Diane sat Isabel's husband, Shane. Quiet, avoiding her eyes. Then Diane smiled softly and said Victor was heartbroken by Isabel's obsession with money. Isabel's hands trembled as she slowly opened the thick folder in front of her. Inside were every receipt she'd sacrificed her life for. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you loved most, stay with this story until the end. Because sometimes, the kindest woman in the room becomes the most dangerous once she finally stops staying silent. 6 months earlier, Isabel Gonzales still believed exhaustion was temporary. Love, she thought, was supposed to feel heavy sometimes. The first time her father collapsed, she had been in the middle of a quarterly financial presentation in Manhattan. 23 floors above the city, surrounded by polished glass walls and executives twice her age, Isabel had been explaining market projections when her phone vibrated 3 times in a row. St. Vincent Medical Center. By the second call, she already knew something was wrong. By the third, she was running. She still remembered the sound her heels made against the marble lobby floor as she sprinted out of the building, ignoring her manager, shouting her name behind her. The February wind hit her face hard the second she stepped into the street, but nothing felt colder than the fear rising in her chest. Her father had never been weak. Victor Gonzales was the kind of man who built things from nothing. He came to America with $80 in his pocket and an accent people mocked before they respected. By 58, he owned one of the most successful regional medical supply companies in Connecticut. But when Isabel walked into that hospital room, he looked small. Too small. Machines beeped around him in steady rhythms, while oxygen tubes framed the face that had once felt invincible to her. "Daddy," she whispered. Victor opened his eyes slowly. Relief softened his expression the second he saw her. "There's my girl." Isabel nearly broke right there. The doctors explained heart complications, fluid retention, stress damage, more tests needed immediately, a possible surgery if things worsened. Diane arrived 40 minutes later wearing cream cashmere and oversized sunglasses despite the rain outside. "What happened?" she asked dramatically. But she didn't walk to Victor first. She walked to the doctor, to the paperwork, to the insurance questions. Even then, Isabel ignored the uneasy feeling crawling beneath her skin. Because grief made people strange sometimes. At least, that's what she told herself. Over the next few weeks, Isabel's entire life became hospital hallways, coffee machines, and sleepless nights under fluorescent lights. She started leaving work early, then she started missing meetings. Then she stopped pretending she could balance both worlds at all. Every morning, she drove from the luxury penthouse she shared with Shane in Manhattan to Connecticut before sunrise. Every night, she returned after midnight with swollen eyes and trembling hands. And every day, the bills grew larger. Private cardiologists, additional scans, medication gaps insurance wouldn't cover, night nurses, experimental treatment consultation patients. The first time Isabel quietly paid one of the invoices herself, she didn't even think twice. Victor had spent his entire life sacrificing for her. Now it was her turn. But by the second month, she had started dipping into savings. By the third, she refinanced part of her retirement account. Shane noticed immediately. "You withdrew $20,000, he asked, one night staring at the banking app on his tablet. Isabel stood at the kitchen counter, heating leftover soup she was too tired to eat. "He needed the specialist," she answered quietly. Shane let out a sharp breath. "Isabel, your father has insurance. Not enough. There's always something not enough lately." She closed her eyes for a second. Not now. Please, not now. He's sick, Shane. And we're bleeding money. The irritation in his voice stung more because of how calm it sounded. Not worried. Not compassionate. Annoyed. Like Victor's illness had become an inconvenience to their lifestyle. Outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan glittered in gold and silver lights. Luxury towers. Rooftop bars. Expensive lives still moving forward while Isabel felt trapped inside a nightmare that never paused long enough for her to breathe. I can earn more money, she said softly. I can't replace my father. Shane rubbed his jaw. You're acting like you're the only person responsible for him. A bitter laugh almost escaped her, because in reality she was. Diane rarely stayed at the hospital longer than 20 minutes. She complained constantly about the smell, the food, the parking, the emotional stress. Sometimes she disappeared for entire weekends claiming she needed mental rest. Meanwhile, Isabel memorized medication schedules and learned how to read heart monitor numbers. She knew which nurses were gentle, which doctors spoke honestly, which nights her father secretly cried because he thought nobody could hear him. One evening after a brutal 14-hour hospital day, Isabel walked toward the cafeteria for coffee when she heard Diane's voice around the corner. She's useful, Diane said casually. Isabel froze. Another woman laughed softly. Useful, Diane sighed dramatically. Please. Isabel lives for being the martyr. She practically enjoys sacrificing herself so everyone thinks she's some saint. The women chuckled together. And Victor eats it up, Diane continued. Honestly, it works out perfectly for me. She handles the ugly parts while I handle everything else. Something cold slid through Isabel's stomach. For a second, she genuinely thought she might throw up. Not because of the cruelty, because of how effortless it sounded, like Isabel's pain had become convenient entertainment. She backed away quietly before they saw her gripping the coffee cup so tightly the lid cracked beneath her fingers. That night, she sat beside her father while rain slid slowly down the hospital windows. Victor slept most of the evening exhausted after another round of treatment. Isabel adjusted his blanket gently and brushed silver hair away from his forehead. You should go home, he murmured weakly without opening his eyes. I'm okay. You look tired, mija. She smiled despite the ache in her chest. So do you. Victor looked at her then, really looked at her, and suddenly his expression filled with guilt. You gave up too much already. No. Yes. His voice cracked slightly. You always do that. You give and give until there's nothing left of you. Isabel swallowed hard because deep down she knew he was right. She had spent her entire life trying to earn love by being useful. Useful daughters got appreciated. Useful wives got chosen. Useful women got loved. At least that was what she'd always hoped. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Shane? She answered quietly and stepped into the hallway. How is he? Shane asked flatly. Stable tonight. Good. A pause. Then, how much more are you planning to spend on this, Isabel? The hallway suddenly felt freezing cold. Not because of the air conditioning. Because for the first time since marrying Shane Whitmore, Isabel realized she sounded alone. Truly alone. The Gonzales estate looked beautiful from the outside. That was the cruelest part. Warm, golden lights glowed through towering windows while expensive jazz drifted softly across the backyard patio. Luxury cars lined the curved driveway. Inside, crystal glasses clinked beneath chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Everything looked elegant, stable, perfect. Exactly the kind of illusion Diane Whitaker Gonzales spent her entire life mastering. Isabel sat in her car for a full minute before going inside. She checked her reflection in the mirror and immediately regretted it. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her makeup barely covered the exhaustion carved into her face. Her long black hair was tied back in a rushed low bun that had already started falling apart. She looked like someone surviving. And in Diane's world, survival was never glamorous enough. The moment Isabel stepped through the front doors, she smelled expensive perfume and roasted garlic from the catering staff moving through the dining room. Diane spotted her instantly. "There she is," Diane announced, brightly loud enough for half the room to hear. Poor Isabel practically lives at the hospital now. A few guests gave sympathetic smiles, others gave judgmental ones. Isabel forced herself to smile politely. "Traffic was bad," she said quietly. Diane tilted her head with fake concern. "Oh, honey, you should really take better care of yourself. Stress ages women so quickly." The comment landed exactly the way Diane intended. Soft enough to sound harmless, sharp enough to wound. Shane appeared beside Isabel moments later, one hand sliding casually into his pocket. "You made it," he said. No kiss, no warmth, just obligation. Isabel looked around the room. Investors, family friends, board members from Victor's company, wealthy couples who spent more time talking about Aspen vacations than actual emotions, people who admired appearances more than truth. She suddenly realized Diane hadn't invited guests for support. She'd invited witnesses. "Dinner's almost ready," Diane said smoothly. "Everyone's been asking where you are." Another subtle humiliation. As if Isabel had inconvenienced the evening by being late after spending 11 hours helping her father through cardiac testing. One of Victor's business associates approached Isabel with a sympathetic smile. "How's your father holding up?" She softened immediately. "He's fighting." "Well," the man said awkwardly, "at least Diane's been keeping everything together at home." Something flickered across Isabel's face before she could stop it. Diane noticed. Of course she noticed. "Oh, please," Diane laughed modestly. "I'm just doing what any wife would do." Isabel bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted blood. Because any wife would have been there. Any wife would have known the names of Victor's medications. Any wife would have noticed he stopped sleeping through the night because the pain had become unbearable. Any wife would have sat beside him during the MRI instead of attending charity luncheons in white designer coats. But Isabel stayed silent. For her father. Always for him. Dinner was announced shortly after. The long dining table looked like something from a magazine spread, silver candle holders, imported wine-white orchids arranged perfectly down the center. And there was no seat for Isabel. Not at the main table. Her chest tightened. Diane pretended surprise immediately. "Oh my goodness," she said, touching her chest dramatically. "There must have been a mistake." "No mistake. There never was." A server quickly added a chair near the far end of the table beside two distant relatives Isabel barely knew. Humiliation burned beneath her skin while guests awkwardly avoided eye contact. Shane saw it happen and still said nothing. That hurt worse than Diane. Because betrayal from enemies was expected. Betrayal from someone who once promised to love you forever hollowed you out from the inside. Throughout dinner, Diane controlled every conversation effortlessly. She told stories about Victor, about their struggles, about how emotionally exhausting the illness had been for her. At one point, she even dabbed beneath her eyes with a napkin, while several women comforted her sympathetically. Meanwhile, Isabel sat there physically aching from exhaustion after another sleepless week at the hospital. Invisible. Then came the passive comments. "Oh, Isabel," Diane said lightly while cutting into her salmon, "you really shouldn't carry all this stress alone. Professionals exist for a reason." A few people nodded politely. Another woman added, "Caregiver burnout is very real." Diane sighed dramatically again. She refuses to let go of control. Isabel stared down at her untouched plate. Every word sounded reasonable individually. Together, they painted her as unstable, obsessive, difficult. Exactly how Diane wanted her perceived. Victor sat quietly at the head of the table, thinner than Isabel had ever seen him. His skin looked pale beneath the warm lighting. Even lifting his wine glass seemed to cost him energy. And still, whenever his eyes found Isabel, guilt filled them, like he knew, like he saw everything happening and hated himself for lacking the strength to stop it. Halfway through dinner, one of the board members leaned toward Diane. "I heard Victor updated the estate planning recently." The room shifted subtly. Diane smiled carefully. "We made some adjustments, yes." Something cold slid through Isabel's stomach. Victor looked down immediately. Diane continued casually. "Illness changes perspective. It makes you realize who truly supports your peace." There it was. Not direct enough to challenge, but deliberate enough to poison. Another guest asked gently, "That must have been difficult for the family." Diane gave Isabel a sad smile. Sometimes love and financial pressure become hard to separate. The silence afterward felt deafening. Isabel looked at Shane. "Please, say something. Anything." But Shane only reached for his wine glass. Coward. The word hit her so suddenly it startled her. Not husband. Not partner. Coward. For the first time, Isabel saw him clearly, not as the man she kept trying to save, but as someone deeply invested in comfort. Someone who would always choose the easier side of a conflict if it protected his image, even if it destroyed her. Victor suddenly coughed harshly into his napkin. The room shifted immediately. Isabel stood instinctively. "Dad." "I'm fine," he rasped, but he wasn't. She could tell from the strain in his breathing. Diane touched his arm quickly before Isabel could reach him. "Sweetheart, don't upset yourself." Upset yourself. As though his daughter's concern was the problem. Victor looked toward Isabel again. His expression tightened with urgency. "Mija," he said weakly. Isabel moved closer, immediately. "What is it?" His trembling hand caught hers. "There's something I need to tell you," before Diane interrupted instantly. "Victor." She snapped softly, still smiling for the guests. "The doctor said no stress tonight." Her tone sounded caring. Her eyes did not. Victor hesitated, and whatever he'd been about to say disappeared behind exhaustion. The moment shattered, just like Diane intended. Later that night, Isabel stood alone on the back terrace while cold Connecticut wind swept through the trees. Inside, laughter echoed faintly from the dining room. Shane eventually stepped outside beside her. "You okay?" he asked. The question almost made her laugh. Was she okay? Her father was dying, her marriage felt hollow, and an entire room full of people had just watched her get quietly humiliated while pretending not to notice. "Do you believe her?" Isabel asked suddenly. Shane frowned. "Believe who, Diane?" He exhaled slowly. "I think everyone's under stress." "That's not an answer." Shane rubbed the back of his neck. "She thinks you've become intense lately." Isabel stared at him in disbelief. Intense. "You've been emotional, Isabel. Emotional." Such a convenient word men used when women finally started noticing mistreatment. Her eyes burned suddenly, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in that house. Not for people who fed off her pain. Inside the dining room, Diane laughed loudly at something someone said. And for the first time in her life, Isabel realized something terrifying. Diane wasn't afraid of losing Victor. She was preparing for what came after. Room 814 smelled like antiseptic recycled air and fading hope. By late April, Isabel knew every crack in the hospital ceiling above her father's bed. She knew which vending machine on the third floor ate dollar bills. She knew Monica Reeves preferred peppermint tea during overnight shifts, and that Victor's oxygen levels dropped whenever anxiety hit him too hard. The hospital had become its own universe. A cold, exhausting universe where time no longer moved normally. Outside spring arrived in Connecticut with blooming trees and warmer evenings. Inside room 814, everything still felt gray. Victor slept most afternoons now. The medications made him drowsy, and the strain on his heart left him too weak to stay awake for long stretches. Sometimes Isabel sat beside him for hours, listening only to the rhythmic beep of monitors while spreadsheets and unpaid invoices waited untouched inside her laptop bag. Her old life barely existed anymore. One Tuesday evening, Monica entered quietly carrying fresh blankets. "You should go home tonight," the nurse whispered gently. Isabel smiled faintly without looking up from the medical paperwork in her lap. "You sound exactly like my father." "That's because both of us have functioning eyes." That earned the smallest laugh Isabel had managed in days. Monica softened. "When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours?" Isabel didn't answer, because she genuinely couldn't remember. Monica adjusted Victor's IV carefully before lowering her voice. "He talks about you constantly, you know." Isabel looked up. When you leave the room," Monica smiled, sadly. "He worries about you more than himself." That nearly shattered her, because no matter how exhausted she became, no matter how cruel Diane acted, Isabel still felt guilty any time she wasn't there. Like loving her father enough could somehow keep him alive. Victor stirred weakly against the pillows. "Mija." Isabel immediately stood and moved closer. "I'm here." His tired brown eyes found hers, and relief softened his face instantly. Always relief, as though some part of him feared she'd eventually stop coming. "How long was I asleep?" "About an hour." Victor sighed softly. "You should have rested too." "I'm fine." He gave her a look. That father look. The one that said he knew she was lying even when she smiled. "You used to be terrible at lying when you were little," he murmured weakly. A lump formed instantly in Isabel's throat. "Still am, apparently." "You'd hide broken things behind your back." His voice grew faint with memory. "Then you'd smile too hard." She laughed quietly through burning eyes. "I was 6. You still do it." That hit deeper than he probably intended. Because he was right. She hid pain beautifully now. She hid loneliness, exhaustion, humiliation, fear, especially fear. Victor shifted painfully before reaching for her hand. His skin felt thinner lately. "Fragile." "Listen to me carefully," he said. Something in his tone made Isabel straighten immediately. "What is it?" He looked toward the closed hospital door first, checking, making sure they were alone. Fear crept slowly into Isabel's chest. "Your stepmother." Victor exhaled shakily. "I made mistakes with Diane." Isabel stayed silent, because there were truths people only admitted near the end of their lives, and she had begun to realize her father was carrying many of them. "She wasn't always like this," he whispered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Outside the room, footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway, while rain tapped softly against the windows. Victor squeezed her hand weakly. "I should have protected you better." Emotion slammed into Isabel so suddenly she nearly looked away. "No." "Yes." His eyes filled with tears, and seeing her father cry felt unnatural in a way that physically hurt her chest. "You were always the one sacrificing," he whispered. "Always cleaning up everyone else's damage." Isabel swallowed hard. "You don't need to worry about me. That's exactly what scares me." A tear escaped before she could stop it. Victor noticed immediately. "You know what your problem is?" he asked softly. She laughed shakily. "We don't have enough time for that list." For the first time in weeks, he smiled. A real smile. "You love people harder than they deserve." That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep inside her, because suddenly, every recent memory hurt differently. Shane dismissing her exhaustion, Diane weaponizing her kindness, family members quietly judging her while she drained her savings trying to keep her father alive. Victor continued quietly. "People like you think love means endurance." Isabel stared at him silently. "But love without respect becomes survival," he whispered. The room fell still after that. Even the machines sounded quieter somehow. Victor closed his eyes, briefly exhausted from speaking so much. Isabel gently brushed silver hair away from his forehead while emotion tangled painfully inside her chest. After a moment, he opened his eyes again. "There are documents," he said weakly. Her pulse quickened. "What documents?" "I made arrangements for what?" His breathing became uneven. "For you." Confusion spread across her face. Victor tried to sit up slightly, frustration flashing when his body wouldn't cooperate. "I knew—" He stopped to catch his breath. "I knew things could become complicated after he died." Neither of them said it. Neither needed to. "I already made sure you'd be protected," he whispered. Before Isabel could ask another question, the hospital room door suddenly opened. Diane. Perfect makeup, cream trench coat. Not a single sign she'd rushed to get there. Her eyes immediately moved between them. Calculating. "What's going on?" she asked, lightly. Victor's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Isabel to notice the tension tightening beneath his exhaustion. "Nothing," Victor said quietly. Diane smiled, too quickly. "Well, your cardiologist called. Apparently someone decided stress and long emotional conversations were a good idea tonight." The passive aggression in her tone coded every word. Isabel stepped back slightly. "I was just sitting with him." Diane placed her designer handbag down before moving closer to Victor's bed. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" The tenderness sounded practiced, like lines from a performance she'd perfected years ago. Victor looked tired suddenly. Not physically, emotionally tired. "I need water," he murmured. "I'll get it," Isabel said immediately. Diane smiled without warmth. "I can handle my husband." My husband. Possessive. Territorial. Isabel forced herself not to react. She grabbed her purse quietly instead. "I'll let you rest." Victor looked panicked for half a second. "Mija. I'll come back tomorrow." He looked like he wanted to say something else. Something important. But Diane was already adjusting his blankets while watching Isabel too carefully. The moment was gone. Again. Isabel stepped into the hallway feeling strangely unsettled, like she'd almost heard a warning. As she waited near the elevator, she realized she'd forgotten her phone charger inside the room. With a tired sigh, she turned back. The hallway lights dimmed slightly for evening hours, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Isabel walked quietly toward room 814, stopping just before the partially closed door. Inside, Diane stood beside Victor's bedside drawer, opening it. Isabel frowned. "What are you doing?" Diane startled visibly before quickly shutting the drawer. Too quickly. "Oh," Diane said smoothly. "You scared me." Isabel's eyes narrowed slightly. Victor looked uneasy. "I forgot my charger," Isabel said slowly. Diane smiled. "I was just organizing some paperwork. Hospitals lose things constantly." Paperwork. Something cold slid down Isabel's spine, because Diane's hand still rested protectively over the closed drawer. And for the first time, Isabel had the unmistakable feeling that whatever her father was trying to leave behind, Diane was already trying to find it first. By May, Isabel barely recognized her own apartment. The penthouse she once loved now felt cold in ways expensive furniture couldn't fix. Everything inside still looked beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, soft cream couches, marble countertops, designer lighting. Shane had insisted on importing from Italy. But emotionally, the place felt hollow. Like a hotel room people slept in without actually living there. Isabel stepped inside close to midnight after another 14-hour hospital day. Her shoulders ached from exhaustion and her head pounded from surviving on coffee and anxiety. The apartment was dark except for the glow of Shane's office down the hallway. He was still awake. For a second, relief touched her chest. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he'd ask how Victor was doing. Maybe he'd notice she looked like she was falling apart. Isabel kicked off her heels quietly and walked toward the office. Shane sat behind his laptop wearing a fitted black sweater, expensive watch, glinting beneath the desk light. Half a glass of whiskey rested beside him. He didn't even look up immediately. "You're late," he said, flatly. The tiny spark of hope inside her disappeared instantly. The cardiologist wanted to discuss treatment options. Shane clicked something on his screen. "Mm-hmm." Isabel stood there silently for a moment, waiting. Nothing came. Not, "How's your dad?" Not, "How are you holding up?" Nothing. Finally, she walked toward the kitchen and poured herself water with trembling hands. "Did you eat?" she asked quietly. "I ordered already." Of course he had. Alone, without asking if she wanted anything. She stared down at the city lights outside the windows while silence stretched painfully between them. This wasn't how marriage was supposed to feel. Was it? Eventually, Shane walked into the kitchen holding his whiskey glass. "We need to talk about finances." Her stomach tightened immediately. Not because of the words, because of his tone. Cold. Corporate. Like she'd become another inconvenient transaction. "I already told you I'm handling it." "That's the problem," he replied sharply. Isabel turned toward him. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means every week there's another bill. Another transfer. Another emergency expense. He's dying, Shane. And we're draining ourselves trying to stop it." The words hit her like a slap. She stared at him in disbelief. "Draining ourselves, yes. He's my father, and he's had a full life." The silence afterward felt violent. Isabel actually stepped back slightly, because no decent person said something like that. Not about someone's parent. Not about a man fighting to stay alive. Shane exhaled impatiently. "I'm being realistic." "No," Isabel whispered. "You're being cruel." He rubbed his forehead. "Everything in our life revolves around that hospital now. Because my father is dying." The sentence screamed inside her head, but exhaustion swallowed it before it could reach her mouth. Instead, she asked quietly, "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" Shane looked away first, and somehow that hurt even more. Weeks ago, Isabel would have fought harder. Weeks ago, she would have explained herself through tears and guilt and desperate attempts to make him understand. But something inside her had started changing recently. Pain had a limit. And once someone crossed it enough times, numbness quietly took its place. "I'm taking a shower," she said softly. Shane muttered something under his breath. "What?" "Nothing." "No. Say it." He hesitated. Then, "You care more about your father than your own marriage." There it was, the real resentment. Isabel laughed once. A small, broken sound. "My father is in heart failure, and I'm your husband. You're supposed to be my partner. I didn't sign up to bankroll your family." The room went completely still. Every muscle in Isabel's body tightened, because suddenly every sacrifice she'd made for Shane replayed in brutal detail. The promotions she turned down to relocate for his career, the loans she helped him pay early in their marriage, the years she spent emotionally shrinking herself every time he needed to feel important. And now he spoke about her dying father like a financial burden. Something inside her cracked quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough. Without another word, Isabel walked toward their bedroom. Shane didn't follow. That hurt too. Inside the bedroom, she changed slowly while trying not to cry from sheer exhaustion. Her body felt heavy. Her chest felt permanently tight now, like grief had physically rooted itself beneath her ribs. She plugged her phone into the charger beside the bed and noticed Shane's tablet lying nearby. The screen lit up. A message notification appeared. "Claire Dalton." Isabel froze. At first, she told herself not to look. Healthy marriages required trust. Healthy people respected privacy. Healthy relationships didn't survive on suspicion. But healthy relationships also didn't feel like emotional isolation chambers. Before she could stop herself, she picked up the tablet. The message preview was short. Claire. Dinner tonight was fun. Wish you didn't have to leave so early. The blood drained from Isabel's face. Her fingers moved before her brain fully caught up. She opened the messages, and suddenly the room felt difficult to breathe in. Weeks of conversations. Flirting, private jokes, late-night drinks, complaints about Isabel. One message stopped her cold. Claire. She sounds exhausting, honestly. Shane. You have no idea. Isabel stared at the screen while her heartbeat pounded violently in her ears. Another message. Claire. Why are you even staying, Shane? Timing. Timing. Not love, not commitment. Timing. Like their marriage was just a strategic inconvenience waiting for the right exit. The bedroom door opened suddenly. Shane stopped cold when he saw the tablet in her hands. For one full second, neither of them moved. Then Isabel looked up slowly. Who is Claire? Shane's jaw tightened instantly. Give me the tablet. Who is she? It's not what you think. Every cheating man in history probably said those exact words. Isabel's voice shook, despite how hard she tried controlling it. You were having dinners with her while I was sleeping in hospital chairs. Shane stepped forward. Lower your voice. The audacity of that almost made her laugh. You embarrassed me, he hissed quietly. People at work are already talking about how unstable you've become. Unstable. There was that word again. The favorite weapon people used against exhausted women. I'm unstable, she whispered. You've been emotionally impossible lately. My father is dying, and you've made that everyone else's responsibility. The cruelty of it stunned her speechless. For months, Isabel had blamed stress, pressure, fear. But suddenly, she saw something much uglier. This wasn't temporary. This was who Shane really was when life stopped being convenient. She handed the tablet back slowly. You know what's funny? She asked, quietly. Shane looked irritated, not guilty. I kept thinking if I just loved people hard enough, eventually they'd love me the same way back. His expression shifted slightly. But not enough. Isabel, don't! Her voice finally hardened. The change surprised even her. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the dark sky while silence swallowed the room. Then Shane made the mistake that changed everything. He sighed coldly and said, Even Diane thinks you're obsessed with money now. The words landed like gasoline on an open flame, because suddenly it clicked. The judgment, the whispers, the coordinated cruelty. Diane and Shane had been talking about her behind her back, maybe for weeks, maybe longer. A sick feeling crawled up Isabel's spine. And then she remembered something else. Earlier that afternoon, while transferring money for Victor's treatment, she had briefly opened their shared business account. There had been a deposit she didn't recognize. $15,000. From Diane Whitaker Gonzales. At the time, exhaustion made her ignore it. Now it felt poisonous. Isabel looked directly at her husband. Why did Diane transfer money into your account? For the first time all night, Shane looked nervous. Shane recovered too quickly. That was the first thing Isabel noticed. Only guilty people learned how to hide panic that fast. He loosened his jaw, looked away casually, then reached for the tablet like the conversation bored him already. It was business-related, he said flatly. Isabel stared at him. Business-related, yes. She transferred you $15,000. So why? Shane exhaled sharply like she was becoming difficult again. Diane wanted advice about some investment restructuring. At midnight, his silence answered more than words could. The ache in Isabel's chest deepened. Not just because he was lying, because he expected her to accept the lie. That was the humiliating part about emotional betrayal. Eventually, people stopped respecting your intelligence too. I'm too tired for this, Shane muttered. Then he walked out of the bedroom. Just like that. Leaving Isabel standing there, surrounded by shattered pieces of a marriage she suddenly wasn't sure had ever been real. She didn't cry. That frightened her more than tears would have, because grief usually found her easily. But now she just felt numb. The next morning, Monica Reeves called at 5:42 a.m. The second Isabel heard the nurse's voice, her stomach dropped. You need to come now. The drive from Manhattan to Connecticut blurred together in cold gray rain and red brake lights. Isabel barely remembered parking the car. She only remembered running through automatic hospital doors, running down the hallway toward room 814, running toward fear she already understood before anyone spoke. Victor looked smaller than ever beneath the white blankets. Machines surrounded him. Nurses moved quickly around the room while doctors spoke in low, urgent voices Isabel could barely process through the roaring in her ears. What happened? She whispered. Monica approached gently. He had a cardiac episode around 4 this morning. Isabel grabbed her father's hand immediately. It felt cold. Too cold. Victor opened his eyes slowly when he heard her voice. Mija. His breathing sounded wrong. Thin. Weak. Like every word cost him pain. I'm here, Isabel whispered, holding his hand against her cheek. I'm here. Victor looked terrified. Not for himself. For her. That realization almost destroyed her. Listen, he rasped. Don't talk right now. You need to listen. Tears burned behind Isabel's eyes instantly. The monitors beeped steadily while rain streaked across the windows behind them. Victor squeezed her hand weakly. After I'm gone? No. Her voice cracked violently. No, don't say that. But he kept going. Promise me something. Isabel shook her head through tears. You're not going anywhere. Victor smiled sadly. That smile, the kind people gave when they already knew the truth. Promise me you'll stop sacrificing yourself for people who would never do the same for you. The room blurred, because deep down, Isabel knew he wasn't only talking about Diane anymore. He was talking about Shane, too. Victor struggled for breath before whispering, You deserve to be loved without earning it. That sentence broke something open inside her. Years of overgiving, years of shrinking herself, years of believing love had to be purchased through loyalty, patience, and endurance. Victor saw it all. Even now. Especially now. Monica quietly stepped out of the room to give them privacy, while Isabel pressed trembling fingers against her mouth, trying not to completely fall apart. I'm sorry, Victor whispered. For what? For not protecting you better. Isabel cried then. Not softly, not elegantly. The kind of crying pulled from somewhere ancient and terrified inside the human body. You did protect me, she sobbed. But Victor looked unconvinced. A few minutes later, Diane finally arrived. Perfect hair, designer coat, large sunglasses despite the storm outside. She rushed into the room dramatically the second doctor stepped back. Oh my God, she gasped loudly. Victor! The performance began immediately. Crying without tears. Voice trembling at exactly the right moments. Even now, Isabel noticed Diane checked who was watching before reacting emotionally. Monica noticed too. Their eyes met briefly across the room. And for the first time, Isabel realized she wasn't imagining things. Other people saw it. Victor's expression changed again when Diane approached the bed. Fear. Actual fear. It flashed so quickly most people would have missed it. But Isabel didn't. Diane leaned over him carefully. You scared me, she whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Victor looked exhausted. Not comforted. Not relieved. Exhausted. A doctor entered moments later, asking Diane to review emergency paperwork regarding treatment authorization and financial liability approvals. Diane immediately shifted into control mode. Questions. Documents. authority. Meanwhile, Isabel sat beside her father, holding his hand, while his heartbeat echoed through monitors. The contrast made something ugly settle inside her stomach. Hours later, Victor stabilized slightly, but the doctors warned them quietly in the hallway. The damage was severe now. Time was becoming uncertain. By evening, the rain had stopped. The sky outside the hospital windows turned deep blue as city lights flickered alive across Connecticut. Victor slept peacefully for the first time all day. Monica handed Isabel coffee around sunset. "You should eat something." "I'm okay." "You keep saying that." Isabel looked down into the paper cup. "I don't know how to stop." Monica's expression softened painfully. "That's the problem." The nurse hesitated before speaking again. "For what it's worth, your father always lights up when you walk into the room." Emotion tightened Isabel's throat instantly. "Diane says she's handling everything," Monica continued carefully. "But you're the one who's actually here." The validation nearly shattered Isabel. Because when someone is constantly manipulated, eventually they start doubting their own reality. Maybe she was emotional. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe Diane wasn't as cruel as she felt. But Monica saw it too. That mattered. Around 9 p.m., Isabel stepped out briefly to grab fresh clothes from her car. When she returned 10 minutes later, she slowed near the partially open hospital room door. Inside, Diane stood beside Victor's bed again. Searching through the bedside drawer, papers rustled quickly beneath her manicured hands. Isabel frowned. "What are you doing?" Diane startled violently before slamming the drawer shut. For half a second, real panic crossed her face. Then the mask returned. "Oh," Diane laughed awkwardly. "You scared me." Victor looked anxious. Not confused. Anxious. Isabel stepped slowly into the room. "Were you looking for something?" Diane crossed her arms immediately. "I was organizing paperwork." At 9 at night, Diane's smile sharpened slightly. "You seem very suspicious lately." There it was again. Deflection. Manipulation. Making Isabel sound unstable instead of answering simple questions. Victor suddenly looked toward Isabel with unmistakable urgency. His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something. Warn her. But Diane moved closer to the bed instantly. Possessive. Blocking. And suddenly Isabel understood something terrifying. Whatever her father had tried to arrange, Diane already knew enough to be afraid of it. Victor Gonzales died 3 days later. The call came at 4:13 in the morning. Isabel had fallen asleep on the hospital couch, with her shoes still on and her head resting awkwardly against the wall. The ringtone dragged her out of exhausted unconsciousness instantly. Monica's voice broke before the words fully came out. "You need to come now." "No. No, no, no." The hallway outside room 814 blurred as Isabel ran barefoot across cold hospital floors. Nurses moved aside quickly while her pulse thundered violently inside her ears. "Please, please let me be in time." When she reached the room, the silence hit her first. Not machines, not voices. Silence. Victor lay still beneath pale blue hospital blankets while the heart monitor displayed one flat, endless line. A doctor was quietly speaking to Diane near the window, but Isabel couldn't hear anything anymore. The world had gone underwater. "No," Isabel whispered. Her voice sounded small, childlike. "No." She walked slowly toward the bed, like approaching him too quickly would somehow make this real. Victor's face looked peaceful. That almost hurt worse, because after months of pain exhaustion surgeries and fear, he finally looked rested. Isabel collapsed into the chair beside him and grabbed his hand instinctively. Cold. Too cold. A sound escaped her throat that barely sounded human. Not elegant grief. Not cinematic crying. Real grief. Ugly grief. The kind that tears through the body like survival itself is breaking a pit. Diane began crying loudly behind her, or pretending to. At that point, Isabel honestly couldn't tell anymore. Monica quietly entered the room a few moments later and rested a gentle hand on Isabel's shoulder. "I'm so sorry." Isabel couldn't speak. Her entire body shook violently while memories crashed through her mind all at once. Victor teaching her to drive. Victor dancing with her in the kitchen when she got into college. Victor working 18-hour days so she'd never struggle the way he did growing up. Victor whispering, "You deserve to be loved without earning it." The grief nearly split her open. Hours later, sunlight slowly rose over Connecticut in soft gray streaks, while funeral arrangements began immediately. And somehow, even in death, Diane still managed to make everything about herself. By noon, she had already contacted photographers, caterers, florists, and half the Connecticut social circle. "It needs to reflect Victor's legacy," Diane told people dramatically while sitting in the hospital family lounge, wearing black designer sunglasses indoors. Legacy. As if grief were another luxury brand she intended to curate beautifully. Isabel sat silently beside the window, clutching her father's wedding ring in her palm. Shane finally arrived around lunchtime. Late. Again. The second he walked in, Isabel stood instinctively desperate for comfort, despite everything. He hugged her briefly. Too briefly. "I'm sorry," he murmured, but his attention shifted toward Diane almost immediately. "How's she holding up?" Not, "How are you holding up her?" Diane. Isabel felt something cold settle deeper inside her chest. The funeral happened 4 days later. It was enormous. Of course it was. Hundreds of people filled the cathedral in downtown Hartford. Business executives, politicians, investors, extended relatives Isabel barely recognized. Victor had spent decades building a reputation people admired, and Diane intended to inherit every piece of it publicly. Rain fell softly outside while black umbrellas lined the church entrance. Reporters even lingered near the steps because of Victor's prominence in the medical industry. Isabel stood near the front, wearing a simple black dress she'd chosen because her father once told her elegance didn't need to beg for attention. Diane arrived 15 minutes late in dramatic couture black with a lace veil. People immediately surrounded her, comforted her, praised her strength. Meanwhile, Isabel stood alone beside the flower arrangements while guests whispered sympathetic comments that somehow still made her feel invisible. One woman touched her arm gently. "Your stepmother has been so strong through all this." Isabel almost laughed. Instead, she nodded politely, because grief had exhausted her too deeply to fight anyone anymore. Inside the cathedral, ushers guided guests towards seating rows. And that's when Isabel realized Diane had removed her from the immediate family section. Her name card was gone. She stared at the seating arrangement in disbelief. One of the ushers looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he whispered quietly. "Mrs. Gonzales requested adjustments this morning." Mrs. Gonzales. Not Isabel. Diane. The humiliation burned hot beneath Isabel's skin. Victor's own daughter. Moved away like an unwanted guest. Shane appeared beside her then. For one stupid, hopeful second, Isabel thought he might finally defend her. "She moved my seat," Isabel whispered. Shane looked uncomfortable immediately. "It's probably just stress." Stress. Always stress. Always excuses. Never accountability. "Shane," she said softly, "that's my father in that casket." He looked away first. Coward, again. The service itself felt surreal. People spoke about Victor's brilliance, generosity, work ethic, philanthropy. Diane cried perfectly at all the right moments. Isabel barely heard any of it, because every few minutes she caught herself expecting her father to walk through the doors, smiling apologetically for being late. Grief made the brain cruel like that. Halfway through the service, Diane stood to give a speech. Of course she did. She walked slowly toward the podium while cameras from local press discreetly angled for better shots. My husband Diane began emotionally, was the love of my life. Isabel stared at her in disbelief. Love Victor had looked afraid of her near the end. But the audience saw only elegance and widowhood. Diane continued dramatically. I stayed by his side every single day. Monica Reeves, seated 3 rows behind Isabel, visibly stiffened. Because everyone who actually worked at the hospital knew that was a lie. He taught me loyalty, Diane said softly, and he valued people who protected his peace. The sentence landed deliberately. Another subtle attack disguised as grief. Several guests glanced toward Isabel instinctively, like Diane wanted. Shame crawled beneath Isabel's skin. Not because she'd done anything wrong, because manipulative people weaponized public perception so effectively. After the burial, guests gathered outside beneath gray skies while dirt hit Victor's casket with soft, devastating sounds. Isabel nearly collapsed hearing it. The finality, the reality, gone. Her father was truly gone. Shane stood nearby, checking his phone when he thought nobody noticed. Diane accepted condolences like royalty greeting subjects. And Isabel realized something horrifying. She had never felt more alone in her life. As guests slowly dispersed toward the memorial dinner, Diane approached Isabel carefully. "We're keeping tonight very intimate," she said softly. Isabel frowned weakly. What family only? The cruelty stunned her, speechless. Diane tilted her head sympathetically. "I just think emotions are very heightened right now. You are not family." That was the real message. Before Isabel could respond, a calm male voice interrupted behind them. "Ms. Gonzales." Harold Bennett stood beneath a black umbrella, his expression unreadable. He handed Isabel a business card, quietly. "If anything today felt wrong," he said carefully, "I think we should talk." For the first time since her father died, someone sounded afraid for her. 3 weeks after the funeral, Isabel sat inside Harold Bennett's law office, staring at the polished mahogany table where her entire life was about to be erased. Rain tapped softly against the windows, overlooking downtown Hartford, while expensive silence filled the room. Diane sat across from her wearing white. White. Not black, not gray. White silk with diamond earrings Victor had probably bought her years ago. The message was intentional. Victory. Beside Diane sat Shane, perfectly tailored in navy, avoiding Isabel's eyes again. He had barely spoken to her all morning, except to ask whether she planned on making a scene. Making a scene. As if grief itself had become socially inconvenient. Harold Bennett adjusted the reading glasses on his nose before opening the estate folder carefully. His expression looked tense, uneasy. Isabel noticed immediately. "Thank you all for coming," Harold began professionally. "We are here for the formal reading of Victor Gonzales's final will and testament." Final. The word punched through Isabel's chest. She still couldn't fully process that her father was gone. Sometimes she reached for her phone, automatically ready to call him after work, before remembering there was nobody left to answer. Harold continued carefully. "To my wife, Diane Whitaker Gonzales. I leave the marital residence, all associated property holdings, my primary investment accounts, and controlling shares in Gonzales Medical Supply." Isabel blinked slowly. Controlling shares. Her father had promised years ago she would eventually help run the company. Shane shifted slightly beside Diane. Harold kept reading. "To my wife, Diane Whitaker Gonzales. I further leave all remaining liquid assets, trust distributions, and estate authority." The room felt strangely quiet, too quiet, like the universe itself paused, waiting for something else. For Isabel's name. For one sentence, one acknowledgement that she existed. But Harold closed the folder slowly instead. "That concludes the primary estate directives." The silence afterward became unbearable. Isabel stared at him. "That's it." Her voice barely sounded like hers. Harold hesitated. There is no financial inheritance specifically designated to you in the final document. Final document. The wording caught her attention immediately. Not father's wishes. Not original plan. Final document. Diane let out a dramatic sigh beside her. This has been emotionally devastating for everyone, she murmured. Isabel turned toward her slowly. What? Diane clasped her hands gracefully. Victor struggled deeply toward the end, especially regarding financial pressure. There it was again. Pressure, money, greed. The narrative Diane had been carefully building for months. Isabel looked toward Shane instinctively. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. Coward. Again. Harold cleared his throat awkwardly. There are also several personal letters included among the estate materials, Diane interrupted smoothly. I think we all know Victor was heartbroken by conflict during his final months. Conflict. Isabel almost laughed from disbelief. She had drained her savings to keep her father alive. She had slept on hospital couches. She had held his hand through surgeries while Diane attended charity galas. And somehow, Diane had rewritten reality so thoroughly that Isabel became the villain. I took care of him, Isabel whispered. Diane tilted her head sympathetically. You certainly involved yourself heavily. Something inside Isabel snapped quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because grief could silence a woman for only so long before humiliation eventually hardened into anger. I involved myself, Isabel repeated. Diane's expression cooled slightly. Victor needed peace near the end, Isabel, not emotional dependency. The audacity of that sentence stunned the room silent. Even Harold looked uncomfortable now. Isabel turned toward Shane one final time. Are you seriously going to sit there and let her say these things? Shane finally looked at her. His face held irritation instead of compassion. This isn't helping. Helping. The word nearly made her sick. Diane sighed softly. I understand this is painful, but your father made his decisions clearly. No. Isabel whispered. He didn't. Diane's eyes sharpened immediately. Excuse me? Isabel slowly reached down beside her chair and lifted the thick leather folder she'd brought. Every receipt, every invoice, every bank transfer. Months of sacrifice compressed into paper. The room shifted the second she placed it on the table. Diane's composure flickered. Just briefly, but Isabel saw it, and suddenly something cold and powerful settled inside her chest. Because for the first time in months, Diane looked nervous. Isabel opened the folder carefully. You said I pressured my father financially, she asked softly. No one answered. She slid the first invoice across the table. Private cardiac specialist. $18,400. Then another. Emergency overnight ICU stabilization. $11,270. Then another. Chemotherapy support treatment. Paid in full. Harold's expression changed immediately. Shane sat up straighter. Diane remained still. Too still. These are hospital bills, Harold said carefully. Yes, Isabel replied calmly. Bills I paid. She pulled out bank statements next. Wire transfers, retirement withdrawals, refinanced assets, canceled investment accounts, the physical evidence of a woman slowly destroying herself financially to save someone she loved. I emptied nearly everything I had, Isabel said quietly. The room stayed silent, except for rain against the windows. I paid for private nurses. Another document slid across the table. Medication gaps insurance refused to cover. Another. Experimental consultations in Boston. Another. Transportation specialists after his second cardiac episode. Diane finally spoke. That was your choice. Isabel looked at her, and for the first time, Diane seemed slightly intimidated by her silence. My choice, Isabel repeated softly. Yes. Victor never asked you to. He cried apologizing to me while dying. That sentence landed like shattered glass across the room. Shane's face shifted slightly. Harold removed his glasses slowly, and Diane's mask cracked. Just enough. He was confused near the end, Diane replied sharply. No, Isabel said calmly. He was terrified. The room froze. Harold looked up immediately. Terrified, he repeated carefully. Isabel held Diane's gaze. Yes. A dangerous silence followed, because everyone suddenly understood this conversation had become much bigger than inheritance. Now it was about truth. Diane crossed her arms. You're emotional. There was that word again. Emotional. The favorite label people used when women started becoming inconvenient to manipulate. But Isabel didn't cry this time. Didn't shake. Didn't beg. Instead, she reached into the folder again and pulled out the final stack of documents. These payments, she said quietly, continued after Victor's accounts were frozen. Harold frowned immediately. Frozen. Yes. She slid forward the transaction dates. All outgoing medical expenses stopped from his personal accounts 3 weeks before he died. Harold's face darkened slightly as he examined the paperwork. Mrs. Gonzales, he said, slowly turning toward Diane. Why were Victor's independent accounts restricted before death? Diane's composure cracked harder this time. It was temporary estate protection. Without medical authorization access, Shane suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable. Isabel noticed instantly, and then another realization hit her. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Diane straightened coldly. My husband trusted me. Isabel stared at her. No, she whispered. He feared you. Silence exploded across the room. Even the rain outside seemed louder now. Harold slowly closed the folder of receipts and looked toward Diane carefully. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Mrs. Gonzales, how exactly did you gain financial control over Victor's accounts during his hospitalization? And for the first time since this nightmare began, Diane. Whitaker. Gonzales had no immediate answer. Diane recovered faster than most guilty people did. That alone terrified Isabel, because truly manipulative people rarely panicked for long. They adapted, redirected, controlled the room before anyone else fully understood what was happening. Diane leaned back slowly in her chair and crossed her legs with practiced elegance. My husband was dying, she said coldly. Of course I took temporary control of financial matters. Harold Bennett didn't look convinced. Without informing Victor's daughter, Diane gave Isabel a thin smile. Victor specifically asked me to minimize stress around financial discussions. Lie. Isabel knew it instantly. Because Victor had spent weeks trying to tell her something before Diane interrupted every conversation. Harold removed his glasses again and rubbed the bridge of his nose slowly. I think we may need to review the timeline surrounding these account transfers more carefully. Something dangerous flickered behind Diane's eyes then. Not grief, not sadness, calculation. Are you accusing me of something, Harold? No one is making accusations, he replied carefully. Yet. That word hung invisibly in the room. Shane shifted uncomfortably beside Diane, while Isabel quietly reorganized the receipts back into her folder. For the first time in months, she noticed something surprising. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Pain still lived inside her, heavy and constant, but beneath the grief now sat something colder. Awareness. The meeting ended awkwardly shortly afterward. Diane left first heels clicking sharply across marble floors, while Shane followed close behind her. Not beside Isabel. Beside Diane. Again. At the office elevator, Shane finally turned toward Isabel with visible irritation. What exactly are you doing? Isabel stared at him in disbelief. What am I doing? You blindsided everyone in there. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Sharp. Disbelieving. I paid for my father's care while your stepmother called me greedy. She's grieving. So am I. The words hit harder than she intended, because suddenly Isabel realized nobody had actually allowed her to grieve properly. Not Shane, not Diane, not the relatives whispering behind her back. Everyone expected her to stay composed while being emotionally dismantled in public. Shane lowered his voice. "You're making this uglier than it needs to be." "No," Isabel replied quietly. "I'm finally making it honest." His jaw tightened. "That's dramatic." There it was again. Every emotion she expressed became overreaction. Every truth became drama. Every boundary became hostility. Shane stepped closer. "Look, Diane says Victor changed near the end. Maybe he saw things differently." Isabel stared at him for a long moment, then asked softly, "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" For one brief second, guilt flashed across Shane's face, but cowardice buried it quickly. "I'm trying to keep peace." "No," Isabel whispered. "You're trying to stay comfortable." The elevator doors opened behind him. Shane hesitated, like he wanted to say something else. Then he stepped inside beside Diane anyway. And the doors closed between them. That night, Isabel sat alone inside the penthouse, staring at old family photo albums spread across the dining table. Rain hammered Manhattan windows, while half-finished tea sat forgotten beside her. Photo after photo showed a version of life that suddenly felt fictional. Victor teaching her to ride a bike. Victor holding her graduation flowers. Victor hugging her at her wedding while Shane smiled proudly beside them. Had any of it been real? Or had she simply loved harder than everyone else? Her phone buzzed around 11:30 p.m. Unknown number. For a second, she almost ignored it. Then she answered quietly. "Hello, Ms. Gonzales." A woman's voice. Soft. Nervous. "This is Monica Reeves from St. Vincent." Isabel sat upright immediately. "Is everything okay?" A pause. "Then I think there's something you should hear." Fear crawled slowly into Isabel's stomach. "What do you mean?" Monica lowered her voice. "The night before your father passed, he asked me to help him record something." Every muscle in Isabel's body tightened. "A recording." "Yes." Silence filled the apartment. Rain pounded harder against the windows. Monica continued carefully. "I wasn't sure whether I should get involved, but after the funeral, after the will reading," she exhaled, shakily. "Something feels wrong." Tears instantly burned behind Isabel's eyes, because finally someone else said it aloud. Wrong. Not emotional, not dramatic. Wrong. "When can I hear it?" Isabel whispered. "I can meet you tomorrow morning before my shift." "Yes." Too fast. Too desperate. "Yes, please." They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the hospital. After the call ended, Isabel sat motionless for several minutes. Her heart pounded violently now, because deep down, she already knew. Victor had been trying to warn her. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Monica looked exhausted when she entered the coffee shop wearing navy scrubs and minimal makeup. She carried an old phone charger cable wrapped carefully around her hand. "Thank you for meeting me," Isabel said immediately. Monica nodded nervously and sat down across from her. "I need you to understand something first," she whispered. "Your father loved you very much." Emotion tightened Isabel's throat instantly. Monica swallowed hard, and he was afraid. That sentence chilled Isabel completely. Monica unlocked her phone slowly. The recording starts abruptly because he was struggling to breathe. Isabel's hands trembled as Monica pressed play. Static crackled softly through the speaker. Then Victor's voice, weak, fragile, but unmistakably him. Isabel covered her mouth instantly. "Mija," Victor whispered painfully through uneven breathing. "If you hear this, it means I waited too long." Tears blurred Isabel's vision immediately. "I'm sorry," Victor continued weakly. "I tried to fix things before." A coughing fit interrupted him. Monica looked away respectfully while Isabel silently shattered. Then Victor whispered something that made her blood run cold. Diane keeps pushing papers at me when I'm medicated. Isabel froze. She says it's temporary. Routine? But I don't trust what she's changing anymore. The room tilted slightly. Victor struggled for breath again. You need to find the original documents. Original documents. Not final will. Original. Isabel's pulse thundered violently now. There's an envelope, Victor whispered. In my old office. Another cough. Then finally, and Isabel. Don't trust Shane. The recording ended. Silence swallowed the table. Isabel stared at the phone in complete shock. Not trust Shane. Not trust her own husband. Monica looked devastated, watching her process everything. I'm so sorry, she whispered. But Isabel barely heard her, because suddenly dozens of moments rearranged themselves violently inside her mind. The money transfer, the secrecy, the silence, the betrayal. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Isabel realized this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was conspiracy. The rain started again the moment Isabel pulled into the parking lot of Gonzales Medical Supply. Dark clouds hung low over Hartford, while thunder rolled somewhere far in the distance. The entire building looked different now. Colder, like her father's absence had drained warmth from the walls themselves. Victor had built the company 26 years earlier inside a rented warehouse with 2 employees and borrowed money. By the time Isabel was 34, Gonzales Medical Supply had contracts across 3 states and partnerships with major hospitals. Victor used to joke that the building was his 3rd child. Now Diane owned it, at least on paper. Isabel sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, while Victor's final words replayed endlessly inside her head. Don't trust Shane. The sentence hurt differently every time she remembered it, because some part of her still wanted desperately to believe there had been a misunderstanding. Not about Diane, about Shane. Her marriage couldn't possibly have been this hollow. Could it? Lightning flashed across the gray sky as Isabel finally stepped out of the car and hurried toward the entrance. The lobby was nearly empty after business hours. Only a receptionist looked up briefly before recognizing her. Ms. Gonzales, the woman said softly. I'm sorry for your loss. Isabel managed a weak smile. Thank you. The elevator ride to Victor's executive floor felt endless. Every memory inside this building suddenly hurt. Childhood afternoons spent doing homework in her father's office, celebrating company milestones. Victor proudly introducing her to executives as my smartest investment. By the time the elevator doors opened, Isabel's chest ached so badly she almost turned around. But she kept walking. Victor's office sat at the end of the hallway behind dark walnut doors with his name still engraved in gold lettering. Victor Gonzales, founder and CEO. The sight nearly destroyed her. For a second, she simply stood there staring at the name. Gone. He was truly gone. Isabel unlocked the office slowly. The familiar scent hit her immediately, coffee leather cedarwood cologne. Her father. The room remained untouched since his death. Papers sat neatly stacked across the massive desk, while framed photographs lined the shelves. One photo showed Victor hugging Isabel at her college graduation. Another showed them fishing by the lake when she was 12. Tears instantly blurred her vision. You knew, she whispered into the empty room. Victor had known something terrible was happening before he died, and he'd been trying to protect her anyway. Isabel closed the office door quietly and moved toward the desk. An envelope. That's what he'd said. There's an envelope. She searched carefully through drawers first. Nothing. Then filing cabinets. Nothing again. Frustration slowly built beneath her grief. Where would he hide something important? Her eyes moved around the office desperately. Bookshelves, storage boxes, family photos. Then suddenly she remembered something. Years ago, Victor used to hide birthday cards for her inside old accounting ledgers as a joke, because nobody willingly opens accounting books. A shaky laugh almost escaped her. Still impossible to surprise me normally, huh? She crossed quickly toward the built-in bookshelf near the back wall and started checking older financial binders. Nothing. Then halfway through the second shelf, voices. Outside the office. Isabel froze instantly. A man's voice, Shane, and another Diane. Panic surged through her chest. Why were they here? Quickly. Isabel stepped behind the partially open storage room connected to Victor's office just as the main door unlocked. Diane entered first, wearing a cream trench coat despite the storm outside. Shane followed behind her, looking tense. "You said nobody was here," Shane muttered. "They shouldn't be," Diane snapped quietly. Isabel's pulse thundered violently. What the hell were they doing? Diane walked directly toward Victor's desk and opened drawers aggressively. "She has something," Diane hissed. Shane rubbed his jaw anxiously. "Maybe Harold's just bluffing." "No. Harold's suspicious." The room fell silent except for rain against the windows. Then Shane said the sentence that shattered the final illusion Isabel still carried about him. "You should have handled the paperwork before he got worse." Paperwork. Not grief. Not Victor. Paperwork. Diane glared at him. "I did handle it." Victor signed the final version. While medicated. The room froze. Even Diane seemed startled. Shane said it aloud. Isabel pressed a trembling hand over her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. Her entire body felt ice cold. Diane lowered her voice sharply. "Do you want to destroy both of us?" Shane ran frustrated fingers through his hair. "I'm saying this is getting messy." Messy. That's what her father's death had become to them. A mess to manage. Diane continued searching through cabinets. She doesn't know enough yet. Yet. The word nearly made Isabel dizzy. Shane leaned against Victor's desk heavily. She heard the recordings. Diane stopped moving instantly. "What recordings? I don't know. Harold mentioned evidence this morning." Diane's face darkened with genuine fear for the first time. And suddenly Isabel understood something terrifying. Whatever Diane did, it was serious enough to scare her now. She was never supposed to fight back. Diane whispered angrily. The sentence hit Isabel harder than she expected. Not because it surprised her, because it confirmed exactly how little they thought of her. They expected grief to keep her obedient, expected kindness to keep her weak, expected heartbreak to make her easier to erase. Shane exhaled slowly. "She's different lately." Diane laughed coldly. "She's emotional." There was that word again. Emotional. As if pain automatically invalidated truth. Diane moved toward the bookshelf suddenly, toward Isabel. Her pulse exploded instantly. One more step and she'd be discovered. But Shane interrupted first. "What exactly are we looking for?" Diane stopped. Victor mentioned old trust documents before he died. Trust documents. Isabel's mind raced. Original documents. Victor's warning. The envelope. It was all connected. Diane crossed her arms tightly. If Isabel finds them before we do, everything becomes complicated. Everything. Not inheritance. Everything. Meaning, Diane knew the final will could collapse if the original trust surfaced. Shane looked pale now. "Maybe we should just settle with her quietly." Diane turned viciously cold. "And lose control of the company. She's still his daughter. And you're still financially dependent on me." Silence. Isabel felt physically sick. Dependent. That explained the transfers, the loyalty, the cowardice. Shane hadn't only betrayed her emotionally, he sold her out. The realization carved through her chest like broken glass. Suddenly, Shane spoke more quietly. She really loved him. Diane rolled her eyes. Love doesn't matter. Documents do. That sentence changed something permanently inside Isabel. because for months she kept hoping Diane had some buried humanity somewhere beneath the manipulation. But no, there was nothing there. Only greed. Outside, thunder cracked loudly across the sky. Diane grabbed her purse sharply. "We'll come back tomorrow." Shane nodded uneasily. The office door closed moments later behind them. Silence returned. But Isabel remained frozen, behind the storage doorway for several seconds longer because her legs suddenly felt too weak to move. Then slowly, very slowly, she stepped back into her father's office. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she stopped seeing herself as a grieving daughter. Now she was a woman at war. Isabel didn't go home after leaving her father's office. She drove aimlessly through Hartford for nearly an hour while rain streaked across the windshield and Victor's voice replayed endlessly inside her mind. Don't trust Shane. At every red light, another memory surfaced, like something rotting underwater, finally rising to the top. Shane dismissing her exhaustion. Shane defending Diane. Shane calling her emotional while secretly taking money from the woman trying to erase her. The betrayal no longer felt abstract. Now it had shape, weight, intent. By the time Isabel finally parked outside the Manhattan penthouse after midnight, something inside her had changed permanently. She was still heartbroken, still grieving, still exhausted beyond words, but the desperate woman begging to be understood. She was disappearing. The apartment lights were on when Isabel walked inside. Shane sat in the kitchen nursing a whiskey glass while scrolling through his phone. He looked up immediately when he heard the door. "There you are." No concern, no apology, just irritation. Isabel removed her wet coat slowly and hung it beside the door. "We need to talk," Shane said. A strange calm settled over her. "Finally?" He frowned slightly at her tone. "What's that supposed to mean?" Isabel walked past him toward the kitchen island and placed her purse down carefully. "I went to my father's office tonight." The color drained subtly from Shane's face. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Isabel to notice. "You were there too," she continued quietly. Shane stood immediately. "Isabel, no." Her voice stopped him cold. "This time, you're going to let me finish." Silence stretched tightly between them. Outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan glowed gold beneath the storm clouds while thunder rolled faintly across the city. Isabel looked at her husband carefully. Really looked at him. And suddenly she realized something devastating. She couldn't remember the last time she felt emotionally safe with him. Not truly safe. Not fully seen. Somewhere along the way, she had become smaller inside this marriage. Quieter, more apologetic, always managing Shane's comfort before her own pain. "How long?" she asked softly. Shane looked confused intentionally. "How long what?" "How long have you been helping Diane?" His jaw tightened. "You're being paranoid." "No." Isabel shook her head slowly. "I'm finally paying attention." That sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Shane exhaled sharply and grabbed his whiskey glass again. "You don't understand what's happening." "Then explain it." She needed financial advice. "Stop lying." The calmness in Isabel's voice startled even herself. Because normally, confrontation terrified her. Normally, she cried first. Backed down first. Tried to restore peace first. But grief had burned something out of her permanently. Shane stared at her for a long moment. Then finally, it wasn't supposed to get this ugly. There it was. Not denial. Admission. The room suddenly felt colder. Isabel folded her arms tightly across her chest. "So you did help her." Shane rubbed frustrated hands over his face. "You're twisting this. You took money from her. She asked me to review some business transitions after Victor passed, while I was paying his hospital bills." Silence. The answer sat there anyway. Isabel laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because sometimes pain became too enormous for tears alone. "My father trusted you. That's not fair." "No." Her eyes finally hardened. You sat beside me while I cried in hospital parking lots. Shane. His expression shifted uneasily. You let me destroy myself trying to save him while you helped Diane protect the money. That's not what happened. Then tell me what happened. Shane slammed the whiskey glass onto the counter harder than necessary. Your father was dying, Isabel, he snapped. Everyone knew things were changing. Changing into what reality? The word echoed sharply through the kitchen. Isabel stared at him in disbelief. Reality. As if her love for her father had been childish fantasy while greed was simply maturity. Shane paced a few steps before speaking again. You became obsessed. Obsessed, yes. Every conversation became about hospitals or treatments or bills. You stopped caring about us. The cruelty of that statement physically hurt, because she had spent months drowning while begging him to simply hold her emotionally above water. Instead, he called her exhausting. You know what the worst part is, Isabel whispered. Shane looked away. I still kept trying to save this marriage while you were already selling pieces of me to Diane. That's dramatic. There it was again. Dramatic, emotional, unstable. Words men used when accountability made them uncomfortable. Isabel reached slowly into her purse. Shane frowned. What are you doing? Then she pressed play. Victor's voice filled the kitchen quietly, and Isabel watched real fear spread across Shane's face for the first time. Diane keeps pushing papers at me when I'm medicated. Shane went pale. You need to find the original documents. Turn it off, Shane whispered, but Isabel kept playing. And Isabel, don't trust Shane. Silence crashed violently across the apartment after the recording ended. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Shane sat down heavily, like his legs suddenly stopped working. He was confused, muttered, weakly. No. Isabel's eyes filled with tears again. He finally saw you clearly. Shane looked genuinely panicked now. You don't understand Diane. You're right. Isabel nodded slowly. I underestimated her. That woman knows people, Shane whispered. She knows judges, board members, investors. So you got scared. Shane looked furious suddenly. You think this was easy for me? Isabel almost laughed again. Easy. Imagine betraying a grieving wife and still seeing yourself as the victim. She promised stability, Shane admitted quietly. The words punched through Isabel's chest. Stability. She said Victor was changing everything anyway. She said fighting her would destroy everyone financially. And you believed her. She was convincing. No. Weak people were simply easy to buy. That was the truth Isabel finally understood. Shane stood again and stepped closer carefully. I never meant for you to get hurt. The sentence disgusted her instantly, because people always said that after choosing selfishness repeatedly. You watched me break apart for months, Isabel whispered, and the entire time you were helping the woman trying to erase me. I was trying to survive. Isabel stared at him quietly, then finally said the sentence she should have spoken long ago. And I was trying to be loved. That one hit him. She saw it immediately. Real guilt flashed across his face for the first time. But it didn't matter anymore, because guilt after betrayal was still selfish. Shane reached toward her carefully. Isabel. She stepped back instantly. The rejection visibly stunned him, not because he loved her deeply enough, because he never imagined she'd stop reaching for him first. You know what's sad, Isabel said softly. I think some part of me already knew. Thunder cracked loudly outside. I just kept hoping you'd become the man I married. Shane's face tightened painfully. I can fix this. No, Isabel whispered. You can't. The truth settled between them heavily. Their marriage wasn't dying tonight. It had been dying quietly for a long time. Tonight was simply the first moment Isabel stopped pretending otherwise. Then Shane made one final mistake. She's dangerous, he warned quietly. You have no idea who you're fighting. Isabel wiped tears from her face slowly, and for the first time since her father's death, she looked unafraid. Neither does Diane. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock Monday morning. By 8:30, Gonzales Medical Supply's executive conference room already buzzed with tension. Rain hammered against the skyscraper windows overlooking downtown Hartford, while board members whispered quietly around polished walnut tables. Expensive coffee sat untouched beside tablets and financial reports no one seemed interested in reading. Because everyone knew this meeting wasn't really about quarterly numbers. It was about control. At exactly 8:57 a.m., Diane Whitaker Gonzales entered the room dressed in ivory silk and diamonds, like a queen arriving for her coronation. Two board members immediately stood to greet her. Investors offered condolences. Lawyers nodded respectfully. Diane accepted sympathy beautifully. Always beautifully. She carried grief like a luxury accessory. Then the room shifted, because Isabel walked in 3 seconds later. And this time, she didn't look broken. She wore a fitted black pantsuit with her dark hair pulled back cleanly, minimal makeup, and the same gold necklace Victor gave her when she graduated college. No trembling hands, no apologetic smile, just calm. Harold Bennett entered beside her, carrying 2 thick legal folders, while Raymond Ellis followed behind them, holding additional financial files. Whispers spread instantly around the room. Diane's polished smile tightened slightly. Shane sat halfway down the conference table, looking pale already. The second his eyes met Isabel's, guilt flashed visibly across his face. Good. Let him sit in it. Diane recovered first. Isabel, she said smoothly, I didn't realize you'd be attending. The room fell quiet. Everyone sensed the hostility beneath her elegant tone. Isabel took her seat calmly across from Diane. My father built this company, she replied quietly. I think I belong here. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Diane folded her hands gracefully. As majority shareholder, I've already begun discussing future restructuring plans. Harold interrupted immediately. That may be premature. Diane's eyes sharpened. Excuse me? Harold placed the legal folders onto the table carefully. There are now legitimate concerns regarding the validity of Victor Gonzales's final estate amendments. The room exploded into whispers. Diane sat perfectly still, too still, like a predator calculating danger. This is outrageous, she said coldly. Is it? Harold replied calmly. Isabel watched the room carefully. Most board members looked confused. A few looked nervous. And Shane looked terrified. Good again. Diane straightened in her chair. I assume this ridiculous accusation comes from Isabel. No, Harold corrected calmly. It comes from evidence. That word changed everything. Evidence. Not grief. Not emotional conflict. Evidence. Raymond Ellis stepped forward nervously with financial records. I worked alongside Victor for 20 years, he said carefully. And some recent account modifications don't match his normal authorization patterns. Diane's jaw tightened instantly. Are you questioning my husband's competence near death? No, Raymond answered quietly. I'm questioning timing. Silence crashed across the room. Harold opened the first folder. We have records showing Victor's independent financial access was restricted while under heavy medication. Diane laughed sharply. That's standard estate protection. Without notifying legal counsel. No answer. Isabel finally spoke then. Calmly, carefully. The way powerful people did when they no longer needed permission to exist. I spent 6 months paying my father's medical bills personally because his accounts suddenly stopped processing payments. She slid copies of receipts across the table. The same receipts Diane once mocked. Now they looked like ammunition. Private ICU care, emergency medication coverage, specialist treatment invoices. Every sacrifice laid out in black and white. Several board members visibly shifted uncomfortably. One older investor frowned deeply. "You paid these yourself?" "Yes." Diane immediately interrupted. She inserted herself unnecessarily into Victor's medical care. Isabel turned toward her slowly. "My father cried apologizing for becoming a financial burden." That silenced the room again, because truth sounded different than manipulation. It carried weight, humanity, pain. Diane crossed her arms. Victor was confused emotionally near the end. Harold looked directly at her. "Then perhaps we should discuss the recording." Real fear flickered across Diane's face. Tiny, but there. Shane closed his eyes briefly like he already knew what was coming. Harold pressed play. Victor's weak voice filled the conference room. "Diane keeps pushing papers at me when I'm medicated." A collective stillness swept across the table. Board members stared openly now. Victor continued, "You need to find the original documents." Diane's composure cracked visibly for the first time. "That recording is completely out of context." But nobody looked convinced anymore, especially after the final sentence played. "And Isabel, don't trust Shane." Every eye in the room shifted toward Shane instantly. His face drained completely white. The humiliation hit him physically. "Good. Let him feel watched for once." Diane stood abruptly. "This is manipulation." Victor was sick. Harold remained calm, which is exactly why concerns about legal coercion become serious. The word coercion echoed dangerously. One board member leaned forward carefully. "Diane, was Victor pressured into signing revised estate documents number too fast? Too defensive? Another mistake?" Isabel watched Diane unravel slowly and realized something important. Manipulative people depended on silence. The second truth entered the room, their control weakened. Raymond opened another file carefully. "There's more." He slid forward, accounting timestamps. "These system access logs show multiple after-hours financial revisions originating from Mrs. Gonzales's authorization credentials." Diane glared at him viciously. "You worked for my husband. I worked for integrity," Raymond replied quietly. That line hung heavily in the room. Shane suddenly spoke for the first time all meeting. "We should calm down." Nobody even looked at him, because cowardice lost authority once exposed publicly. Harold opened the second legal folder slowly. "This morning," he said carefully, "we located documentation connected to Victor Gonzales's original protected family trust." The air left Diane's lungs visibly. "Found it." Isabel's pulse hammered violently now. Harold slid the paperwork across the table. The original trust, signed years earlier, legally notarized, and clearly naming Isabel Gonzales as primary protected beneficiary connected to Victor's company interests and family estate safeguards. Several board members immediately began reading frantically. One whispered, "Oh my God." Diane looked genuinely shaken now. Not elegant, not composed, shaken. "This trust was superseded," she snapped. "Possibly," Harold replied carefully, "if later amendments were legally obtained without coercion." The room exploded again. Questions, voices, tension. And through all of it, Isabel remained completely still, because suddenly she understood something profound. For months, Diane controlled the narrative by making Isabel feel small, emotional, weak. But facts didn't care about manipulation. Receipts didn't care about gaslighting. Truth survived anyway. Diane turned toward Isabel with pure hatred burning behind her eyes now. "You think this makes you powerful?" she hissed quietly. Isabel met her gaze without flinching. "No," she answered calmly. "I think it makes me impossible to erase." That one landed. Hard. Shane stared at Isabel like he barely recognized her anymore. Good. Because Isabel barely recognized herself too. The woman sitting here today wasn't the same exhausted daughter crying in hospital hallways. pain had sharpened her. Grief had awakened her. And betrayal had finally taught her the difference between being kind and being defenseless. The meeting dissolved into legal chaos shortly afterward. But as board members argued and attorneys scrambled through documents, Diane leaned toward Isabel one final time. Her voice dropped low enough only Isabel could hear. This isn't over. For months, that threat would have terrified her. Not anymore. Because Isabel finally understood the one thing Diane never expected. Women who survive heartbreak stop fearing people eventually, especially the ones who caused it. By the end of the week, Diane Whitaker Gonzales was no longer the grieving widow everyone pitied. She was a woman under investigation. News traveled fast in wealthy Connecticut circles, faster when money power and scandal collided together. By Friday morning, whispers followed Diane everywhere from charity boards to country clubs to executive luncheons. Forgery, coercion, estate fraud. People lowered their voices when she entered rooms now. And for the first time in years, Diane was losing control of the narrative. Isabel should have felt victorious. Instead, she mostly felt tired, deeply tired. Not physically anymore, emotionally. Because exposing the truth didn't magically erase grief. It didn't bring Victor back. It didn't undo months of betrayal or the humiliation of realizing the man she married sold pieces of her pain for financial comfort. Some wounds healed slowly, even after justice arrived. Friday afternoon, Isabel sat inside Harold Bennett's office reviewing additional legal documents while rain streaked softly across the windows. Harold looked impressed for the first time since all this began. The board is leaning toward freezing Diane's temporary authority over company assets pending investigation. Isabel nodded quietly. And the estate complicated. Harold sighed. But the original trust changes everything. A soft knock interrupted them. Monica Reeves stepped inside nervously wearing navy scrubs beneath a long gray coat. Harold stood politely. Ms. Reeves, thank you for coming. Monica smiled awkwardly before sitting beside Isabel. How are you holding up? She asked gently. Nobody had asked Isabel that sincerely in a long time. She almost forgot how kindness sounded. 1 hour at a time, Isabel admitted quietly. Monica's eyes softened. That's enough sometimes. Harold opened another folder carefully. Your testimony about Victor's mental state during hospitalization could become very important. Monica nodded slowly. I kept records. Diane should have been smarter than that. But narcissistic people often underestimated quiet observers. Nurses saw everything. Monica pulled several printed notes from her bag. Victor repeatedly expressed fear surrounding document pressure. While heavily medicated, she explained carefully. I documented behavioral distress because hospital ethics require us to note signs of emotional instability or coercion concerns. Harold's eyebrows lifted immediately. This is excellent documentation. Isabel looked at Monica in disbelief. You did this for him? Monica shook her head softly. I did it because something felt wrong. That sentence stayed with Isabel, because intuition was often the first truth women were taught to ignore. Harold reviewed the notes carefully. Then his phone rang. The expression on his face changed immediately after answering. Yes, silence. Then I see. Another pause. Thank you. Send everything immediately. He hung up slowly. What is it? Isabel asked. Harold looked directly at her. Hospital security footage. A chill moved through Isabel instantly. From what day the week before Victor died? Monica frowned slightly. What about it? Harold turned the monitor toward them. There's video of Diane entering Victor's room after visiting hours while carrying estate documents. The room went silent. Harold clicked again. Another angle appeared. Diane, leaving 23 minutes later with papers in hand. Different papers. Even Isabel could tell. Monica covered her mouth softly. Oh my God. Harold leaned back slowly. This could establish document interference. For the first time since Victor's death, Isabel felt something dangerous rising beneath her grief. Not rage, certainty. Diane did this. Not emotionally, not accidentally, intentionally. Hours later, Isabel finally returned to Manhattan. The penthouse felt emptier every day now. Shane had started sleeping in the guest room after their confrontation, though neither of them officially discussed separation yet. Cowards delayed endings when they feared consequences. Isabel entered quietly and nearly froze when she saw him sitting alone in the dark living room. No television, no music, just silence. He looked terrible. Wrinkled shirt, red eyes, unshaven jaw. For once, Shane Whitmore actually looked like a man collapsing beneath his own choices. "I heard about the investigation," he said quietly. Isabel removed her coat without responding. "Diane's lawyers are panicking. Still protecting Diane first." "Interesting. She should panic," Isabel replied calmly. Shane rubbed both hands over his face. "You don't understand how bad this could get." "No," Isabel said softly. "You don't." He looked up sharply. "I made mistakes." The sentence almost sounded rehearsed, like something he practiced alone before she got home. Isabel stayed standing. "I was scared," Shane admitted quietly. "Diane convinced me Victor was shutting you out anyway, so you helped her finish the job." Pain flashed across his face. "I never thought she'd go this far. You mean you never thought I'd fight back?" That one landed hard, because it was true. Everyone expected Isabel to stay soft forever. Even now, Shane still looked shocked by the woman standing in front of him. No tears, no begging, no desperation for his approval anymore. Just clarity. He stood slowly. "I know you hate me." Hate. Funny word. Isabel thought about it carefully. Did she hate him? No. Hatred still required emotional attachment. What she felt now was colder. Disappointment. Grief. Detachment. "I loved you," she whispered instead. The honesty of it visibly hurt him more. Shane stepped closer, carefully. "I loved you too." "No." Isabel shook her head slowly. "You loved being loved by me." Silence. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Women like Isabel made life easier for men like Shane. She supported, sacrificed, forgave, nurtured. And people often confused that devotion with permanence. They thought she would endure anything. Until one day, she didn't. Shane's voice cracked slightly. "I never wanted to lose you." Isabel stared at him for a long moment, then finally asked the question that mattered most. "When did you stop seeing me as a person?" The question visibly shattered him, because betrayal rarely began with cheating or lies. It began when empathy disappeared, when someone's pain became inconvenient instead of sacred. Shane looked away first. Again. "I don't know," he admitted weakly. That answer hurt because it sounded honest. The room stayed quiet, except for distant city traffic beyond the windows. Then Shane whispered something unexpected. "She manipulated me too." Isabel almost laughed. Not because he was entirely wrong. Diane absolutely manipulated people, but manipulation only worked fully when selfishness already existed underneath. "You still chose to betray me," Isabel said softly, and there it was. The truth. Simple, clean, unavoidable. Shane's eyes filled slightly. "I can help you now." "No. I know things about Diane." "I'm sure you do. Please." The desperation in his voice startled her. Not because he suddenly loved her properly, because consequences finally frightened him. Losing money frightened him. Public humiliation frightened him. Being exposed frightened him. But her suffering never had. That realization killed the final remaining piece of their marriage. Isabel walked slowly toward the bedroom hallway before stopping briefly. Without turning around, she said quietly, "The saddest part is, my father warned me about you while he was dying." Silence crashed behind her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Shane finally sounded ashamed. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Isabel finally signed them. Not because she doubted the decision, because endings still hurt even when they were necessary. On the fourth morning, sunlight spilled softly across the Manhattan penthouse, while Isabel stood barefoot beside the marble island, holding the pen in trembling fingers. Shane watched from the opposite side of the room, quiet, exhausted, defeated. He hadn't argued much after the previous night, maybe because deep down he finally understood there was nothing left to manipulate. Some losses arrived too late for repair. Isabel signed slowly. One signature. Years of marriage reduced to ink. When she finished, she slid the documents across the counter without speaking. Shane stared down at them for a long moment, then finally whispered, "Is this really it?" The question almost broke her heart. Not because she wanted to stay, because once upon a time, she would have done anything to hear fear of losing her in his voice. But timing mattered. People often realized someone's value only after exhausting their capacity to love them. And by then, sometimes it was already over. "Yes," Isabel answered softly. Shane looked up quickly. "We can still fix this." She almost smiled sadly. There it is. Still. The belief that she would continue carrying emotional labor for both of them. That if he apologized enough, she'd return to shrinking herself again. But Isabel was finally too tired to abandon herself anymore. "You didn't lose me overnight," she whispered. "You lost me slowly." The room fell silent. Outside the windows, New York moved endlessly forward beneath pale morning skies, while inside the apartment their marriage quietly ended. Shane swallowed hard. "I was scared." "I know. I thought Diane would destroy everything." Isabel nodded slowly. "And you helped her destroy me instead." Pain flashed visibly across his face again. Good. Not because Isabel enjoyed hurting him, because consequences were the first honest thing he'd faced in months. Her phone buzzed suddenly against the counter. "Harold Bennett." She answered immediately. "Hello." "Good morning, Isabel." Harold said carefully. "I have an update." Something in his tone made her straighten instantly. "What happened?" "The court approved temporary suspension of Diane's estate authority pending fraud investigation." Silence. Then Isabel slowly sat down. Not from weakness, from shock. Harold continued. "And there's more. The original trust protections appear fully enforceable." Tears filled Isabel's eyes instantly. Victor. He really had tried to protect her. Even dying. Even terrified. He still tried. Harold's voice softened. "Your father loved you very much." That sentence shattered her harder than legal victory ever could. Because beneath all the betrayal and manipulation and courtroom tension, she was still just a daughter grieving her father. After the call ended, Shane looked at her carefully. "What happened?" Isabel wiped her tears slowly. Diane lost temporary control. He closed his eyes briefly, like part of him already knew this ending was coming. "She's going to panic," he muttered. "No," Isabel said quietly. "She's going to unravel." There was a difference. Panic was temporary. Unraveling happened when someone built their entire identity on control and suddenly lost it publicly. Later that afternoon, Isabel returned to Connecticut alone. Not to the mansion. Not yet. Instead, she drove toward the small lake Victor used to take her fishing at when she was little. The air smelled like rain-soaked trees and early summer grass. Sunlight shimmered softly across the water while distant birds moved through the quiet afternoon sky. For the first time in months, everything felt still. No hospital machines, no lawyers, no accusations, just silence. healing silence. Isabel sat on the old wooden dock and cried harder than she had since Victor died. Because now that survival mode was fading, the grief finally had space to breathe. She cried for her father, for the marriage she thought she had, for the version of herself that kept believing love required self-sacrifice to deserve protection. Eventually, footsteps approached quietly behind her. Harold Bennett. He carried a small envelope in his hand. "I thought you might want this privately," he said gently. Isabel frowned slightly. "What is it?" Harold sat beside her carefully. "We found it hidden inside Victor's office wall safe after the board meeting." The envelope. Her breath caught instantly. Victor's final letter. Her hands shook as she opened it slowly. The handwriting alone nearly destroyed her. "Mija, if you're reading this, then I ran out of time to fix what I should have protected sooner." Tears blurred the page immediately. Harold quietly looked away to give her privacy. "You spent your entire life loving people honestly. Never let this world convince you that kindness was weakness. I saw how much you sacrificed for me. Every bill, every sleepless night, every moment you thought nobody noticed. I noticed." Isabel covered her mouth as sobs escaped her chest. Victor continued. "The problem was never that you loved too deeply. The problem was that too many people around you loved too selfishly." That line settled deep inside her soul, because suddenly everything became painfully clear. Shane didn't destroy her worth. Diane didn't erase her value. They simply revealed themselves. The letter continued. "Do not spend your life begging for loyalty from people who only value convenience. And please, Mija, choose yourself sometimes. Choose yourself." The words felt foreign, uncomfortable, necessary. At the bottom of the letter, Victor had written one final sentence. "You were always the strongest thing I ever built." Isabel broke completely after that. Not from weakness, from love. Real love. The kind that protected instead of consumed. The kind that saw her clearly. By sunset, Isabel finally returned to Manhattan for the last time. She packed quietly, clothes, books, photographs. Only the things that still felt emotionally honest. Shane watched silently from the bedroom doorway. "You're really leaving." Not a question, a realization. Isabel zipped the final suitcase slowly. "Yes." He stepped closer, carefully. "I know I don't deserve another chance." "No," she answered honestly. "You don't." The truth hurt both of them. Shane looked devastated now in a way that finally felt genuine. Too late. That was the tragedy of selfish people. They often learned empathy only after consequences arrived. "I did love you," he whispered. Isabel looked at him quietly, then said the sentence that finally closed the door between them forever. "But not enough to protect me." Silence swallowed the room, and this time, she walked away first. 6 months later, the courtroom finally fell silent. Isabel sat beside Harold Bennett at the front table, while late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall Connecticut courthouse windows. The golden light softened everything it touched: wooden benches, legal files, tired faces, even grief. Across the room, Diane Whitaker Gonzales no longer looked untouchable. The elegant confidence was gone. So were the designer smiles and polished performances. Now she looked exhausted, cornered, real. Funny how truth stripped people down faster than time ever could. The judge adjusted several documents before speaking clearly. After review of the original trust protections, financial records, witness testimony, and evidence of coercive estate interference, the room held its breath. This court recognizes the original protected beneficiary structure established by Victor Gonzales as legally enforceable. Isabel closed her eyes briefly. Not from triumph, relief, pure relief. The judge continued. Temporary estate modifications executed during Mr. Gonzales's medical incapacitation are therefore subject to fraud review and invalidation. A sharp inhale came from Diane's legal team. Nearby reporters immediately began writing furiously, but Isabel barely heard any of it, because all she could think was, "Dad, you really did protect me." The judge finalized the ruling calmly. Control of Gonzales Medical Supply would return to the protected trust structure under Isabel Gonzales's authority pending final estate resolution. Several remaining financial assets would also revert accordingly. Diane looked furious. Not sad, not grieving, furious. Because people like Diane didn't mourn relationships, they mourned lost control. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited beneath bright summer skies while reporters shouted questions the second Diane exited. "Mrs. Gonzales, are you facing fraud allegations? Did Victor Gonzales sign documents under medication? Did you manipulate estate access?" For once, Diane had no perfectly rehearsed answers. She disappeared quickly behind attorneys and black SUVs while whispers followed her like smoke. And Shane? Shane stood alone near the courthouse stairs, looking like a man watching his entire life collapse in slow motion. His reputation at work had already suffered after internal financial investigations exposed his involvement with Diane's unauthorized transition planning. Promotions vanished. Invitations disappeared. Wealthy social circles loved powerful men, not exposed ones. When his eyes met Isabel's across the courthouse steps, something inside her ached unexpectedly. Not love, not longing, just sadness for what they could have been if selfishness hadn't poisoned everything. Shane approached slowly once reporters moved away. "Congratulations," he said quietly. The word sounded painful in his mouth. Isabel studied him carefully. He looked older now somehow. Consequences aged people quickly. "This was never about winning," she replied softly. He nodded faintly. "I know." Silence stretched between them while summer wind moved gently through the city streets. Then Shane asked the question she knew had haunted him for months. "Did you ever really stop loving me?" The honesty of it almost hurt. Isabel looked toward the courthouse columns for a moment before answering truthfully. "No." His face tightened instantly, but eventually she continued softly. "I loved myself enough to leave." That one stayed with him. She saw it, because people often misunderstood empowerment. It wasn't becoming cold. It wasn't revenge. It was finally refusing to abandon yourself for someone else's comfort. Shane swallowed hard. "I wish I understood that sooner." "So do I." And strangely, she meant it kindly, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because healing had started teaching her something important. Holding on to bitterness kept wounds alive longer than necessary. That didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing peace over emotional imprisonment. Shane looked down briefly before whispering, "I really did love parts of you." Parts. Interesting word. Because that had always been the problem. He loved the convenient parts, the nurturing parts, the sacrificing parts, the endlessly forgiving parts. But he never fully loved the human being underneath them. And real love required seeing someone completely. "Goodbye, Shane." Isabel said gently. He nodded slowly. Then for the first time since their marriage began, he let her walk away without asking her to carry his emotions too. 3 months later, Isabel stood inside the old Gonzales estate with construction blueprints spread across the dining table. But the house no longer felt haunted. It felt alive again. Sunlight filled the massive windows while workers moved carefully through renovated hallways upstairs. Fresh paint replaced heavy darkness. The smell of cedarwood and coffee drifted softly through open spaces. The mansion was changing. So was she. "Are you sure about this?" Harold asked while reviewing the renovation plans. Isabel smiled, faintly. "Yes." The original estate could have become a monument to pain, a luxury prison filled with memories of betrayal. Instead, Isabel transformed it into something else entirely. the Gonzales Caregiver Recovery Foundation, a private retreat center offering emotional support, temporary housing therapy resources, and financial assistance for family caregivers overwhelmed by medical crises. Because Isabel knew exactly how invisible caregivers became, how easily they disappeared inside everyone else's suffering. "I think Victor would be proud," Harold said quietly. Emotion warmed Isabel's chest instantly. Not the painful kind anymore. The healing kind. The kind grief eventually became when love outweighed regret. Later that evening, Isabel drove alone toward the lake, where her father used to take her fishing. The same lake where she cried reading his final letter months earlier. Summer light shimmered softly across the water while distant birds drifted over the trees. Peaceful. For the first time in a very long time, peaceful. She sat at the edge of the dock watching sunset colors melt across the sky. And suddenly she realized something surprising. She survived. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but honestly. The betrayal didn't destroy her. The humiliation didn't erase her worth. The abandonment didn't make her unlovable. If anything, it forced her to finally meet herself beyond sacrifice. Victor had been right all along. Her kindness was never weakness. The problem was simply that too many people confused gentle women with women who would tolerate anything. A soft breeze moved across the lake, while Isabel smiled through quiet tears. Real tears this time. Not from heartbreak, from release. Then softly, almost like a prayer, she whispered, "You were right, Dad." The water reflected fading gold beneath the evening sky. And for the first time since this story began, Isabel Gonzales no longer felt like a woman begging to be chosen. She felt free, completely free. Some of the deepest heartbreaks in life don't come from strangers. They come from the people we would have sacrificed everything for. The people we defended, trusted, protected, and loved without limits. And sometimes the hardest lesson a kind person must learn is this: love should never require you to disappear to deserve it. Isabel spent years believing that being needed meant being valued. She thought loyalty would eventually be returned. She thought if she stayed patient enough, forgiving enough, useful enough, the people around her would finally love her the same way she loved them. But real love does not ask someone to suffer silently while everyone else stays comfortable. That's the tragedy many good-hearted people live through. They become so busy saving others that nobody notices they are drowning too. But healing begins the moment you finally understand that kindness and self-respect must exist together. Boundaries are not cruelty. Walking away from betrayal is not weakness. And choosing yourself after years of emotional exhaustion is not selfish, it is survival. The people who manipulate, betray, or underestimate you often mistake your softness for dependence. They assume you will always stay, always forgive, always carry the emotional weight of everyone else's choices, until one day you stop. And that day changes everything, because the strongest women are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they are simply the women who finally decide, I deserve peace more than I deserve painful love. Isabel didn't truly win because she inherited money or exposed Diane. She won because she finally stopped abandoning herself to keep other people comfortable. She learned that real healing begins when you no longer beg for loyalty from people who only loved your sacrifices, but never your soul. If this story touched you, let me know in the comments. Do you think Shane ever truly loved Isabel? And would you have forgiven Diane after everything she did? And if you enjoy emotional stories about betrayal, healing, self-worth, and powerful comebacks, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next story. Sometimes these fictional stories remind us of very real truths we needed to hear.